What is up, guys? Today we are checking out what even is mascot horror from Kane Carter. So make sure you guys hit that like button, subscribe to Kane Carter, and comment down below. So Kane Carter apparently did a survey asking 1,000 people how they define the genre of mascot horror, and the results were kind of bizarre. Over the next month, I created this video essay to explore the survey responses, trace the origin and evolution of the games, or I'm sorry, the genre's definition, figure out what might have gone wrong, and hopefully reach some kind of conclusion. Okay, so this is not like a theory video. It's a video essay talking about the genre of mascot horror. All right, this will be interesting to see because I've never seen anybody actually ask
this
what
video
mascot
might be a
horror
bit difficult for me
is.
for no reason other than the fact that I can't pronounce the letter R very well.
So here
that
we
may
go.
actually make it difficult for you too, because this is going to be a very long video of me talking. Not only will I talk a lot, but the things I talk about
Hello
will be,
Neighbor's
for the most part,
crazy.
inconsequential semantics. I'll talk about numbers, I'll repeat myself.
Bro, it's
and
like 2016 rolled up into one video. It's crazy. We're just seeing all these games.
I'm sharing opinion. This might be a video to put on in the background or while you eat dinner. Or maybe I'm underestimating how much people care about silly things like this. Mascot horror is a media subgenre that has seemingly dominated the indie horror game scene for the past maybe 10 years. It has become so prevalent that I literally now contribute to it for a living. And there's lots to talk about regarding this label, but out of my own curiosity, I wanted to explore one specific part of it, its definition. What is mascot horror? I don't mean what makes a good mascot horror game or what it contributes to the horror game space. I mean literally what counts as a mascot horror game, because when I talk about this genre with friends and fans, and that's obviously like half the conversations I have with other human beings at this point, it has become more clear that the meaning of this term varies from person to person, which is slightly bizarre if you think about it. Everyone knows what a racing game looks like, or how a first-person shooter game plays, but did you know that your definition of mascot horror has a decent chance of not lining up with your friends? So what happened here? What definitions exist?
All right, then I'm gonna say mine. Mine would probably be something exactly like FNAF, because mascot characters are like the characters in front of a store. Like if you got a crab in front of a store and some guy wearing a mascot costume, that's the icon. That's the mascot of it. Yeah, that's crazy. I've only really considered FNAF type of games to be the mascot because they're actually putting the mascot in a horror setting. Bendy could be a mascot horror game too, because he's the face of the company, mascot, whatever, and it's a horror game. I don't know if Hello Neighbor can be considered a mascot horror game, since it was one of the videos in here, because Hello Neighbor is just a horror game about a neighborhood. It's not, there's no mascot, there's no icon,
exist. Why are there multiple in the first place, and could this be changed or fixed? To be clear, none of this really matters, and you can talk about indie horror however you want. This is just a deep dive into how
that's why I would consider Hello Neighbor an indie horror. Well, I mean, all of these are indie horror games, but I would just call Hello Neighbor an indie horror game. There's no subgenre about it.
We got here in the first place. I'm going to go over the two main known definitions of mascot
extra
horror,
title,
the results of a survey I conducted, the creation.
Oh, I actually want to see what some of the people said. I'm pretty sure Kane's going to talk about it, but it's kind of interesting. I say a mascot horror game is more about a monster than a mascot. We say mascot because of FNAF or Bendy that's used monsters as mascots, but I think it's mostly about humanoid or not characters coming to life and coming after yours. A horror game with characters designed specifically to be used in merch or to get popular on social media, hence Five Nights at Freddy's, Bendy, that type of stuff. With gameplay that usually involves free roam, puzzles, and... Well, I feel like mentioning the type of gameplay might be irrelevant here, since the question is, what's a mascot horror game in definition?
Creation and history of the label.
I kind of agree with the one I was just reading, though.
On what mascot horror means. Let's get started.
This is actually interesting. I've never actually heard anybody ask what it is.
A lot of you know what I'm talking about already, but I imagine a fair few of you have been watching and thinking to yourself, what is so confusing about this? Mascot horror is a genre of horror games with mascots, and that's not wrong, but the confusion comes from what mascot is referring to in the name. Because for some people, mascot horror means this: horror games featuring antagonists that are based on corrupted, kid-friendly mascot characters. Pretty straightforward. That fits Five Nights at Freddy's, Poppy Playtime, The Usual Suspects. When you imagine mascot horror, you probably don't even think of a definition, but rather you imagine a cast of big, colourful, maybe furry or plasticky characters, but with scary eyes and sharp teeth. Twisted versions of a friendly face, a literal mascot, or mascots, within the universe that the game takes place in. Some examples of sources that describe the genre like this are the Aesthetics Wiki and TV Tropes. However,
well,
There
you know
is
what?
a
Never
second
mind. I was gonna read it, but the
To
edit
some
went
of
away
you,
so
this will
fast.
sound obvious, and to others it will sound ridiculous. But mascot horror also often means this: horror games with an identity developed through the use of at least one clear mascot. In this second definition, mascot is referring to our world. It's meta, like how Super Mario is a mascot for his games, which is different from the first definition, which requires mascot horror games to include character designs that resemble something you'd see in children's media, literal mascots, like parodies of Chuck E. Cheese or Furbies. Websites like Know Your Meme and
Okay, sorry about that jump cut. I noticed my mic audio was a little low.
Open Dictionary use this broader definition. This is a bit of a square and rectangle kind of situation. If a game fits the first definition, then it's basically guaranteed to also fit the second. But the second definition is more open. It can allow games like Granny and Hello Neighbor
Meta mascot, in-universe mascot.
because the characters in those games are treated as recognizable mascots for their own projects, despite them only being freaky-looking humans and certainly not designed to resemble kid-friendly costumes or animatronics or toys. They're mascots in our world, not in theirs. When I figured out that this disparity was fairly evenly split across the people I spoke to, I had the idea of increasing my sample size by using my platform on the internet. I have a decent enough following that I could probably wrangle up 100 or so people to fill out a questionnaire to find out what exactly they think.
Kane made a
mascot
whole
means.
questionnaire about it.
Or 1,000 people.
Oh my
That's even
God.
better. Let's find out who, out of 1,000 people, think that Baldi's Basics is a mascot horror game. Right. Well, what the f***? That is extremely evenly split. How
Jesus.
could the definition of a genre be so divisive?
Like by a whole
Well, I
percentage.
should add that a fair few people responded to this survey in a way I didn't anticipate. I know for a fact that some of them said that some games were not mascot horror because they didn't find them scary, so they're not horror. That's obviously not the point of the question I'm asking, so we're going to have to assume that more people would have said is a mascot horror game for some games, if only they were scarier. But I'm not going to try.
It's not a horror game because I didn't get scared. Like what? Like what kind of
Incorrect numbers
what kind of
like
shit is
We'll just have to
that?
keep them in mind as we talk about the results.
Bros used the survey to
So let's
insult
go
a
over the
game.
questions I
Like,
asked and what
huh?
the public had to say about them. The first question of the survey asked people how they would define mascot horror and what the mascot in the label was referring to. I'm not going to go over all 1,000 of these
My
responses,
God.
but as expected, there is a pretty even split between people who have the literal, in-universe definition of mascot and those who have the meta, our world definition of it. I would say if we cut out the silly responses, about 60% of
Huggy
people
wuggy
describe the first
burp.
definition,
What was that?
and 40% write some semblance of the second definition. I expected something like that. I then asked whether a larger studio or publisher could, in theory, release a mascot horror game, and the answer is a pretty unanimous yes. It's a bit of a redundant question in hindsight, but I wanted to know whether people thought the genre was strictly tied to indie games. It isn't. Good to know. The next
Definitely is not.
survey went over 15 fairly varied games in the indie horror space, just outright asking people whether specific releases do or do not fall under the mascot horror category. Let's go over those results. Poppy Playtime, 97.7%
Is a
say
mascot
that it
horror
is
game.
mascot horror, 98.2% if we ignore those that weren't familiar with the game. 98% is insanely high, but I think it was expected by everyone. Poppy Playtime, like I said before, is a game that fits both of the big definitions of the genre.
Yeah.
It is the staple, the definitive mascot horror game. Batim has a
Like
slightly
you literally see the face of the company just crawling out of the TV when you're when he's talking about it. That's hilarious.
lower vote of 91.9%, increased by 1% if we remove the unfamiliar respondents. That is still extremely high. It's safe to say people consider Bendy the Demon to be a mascot in his own universe and in
Yeah.
ours. Funny how Joey Drew Studios is a company in both as well. The original Click Team Fusion entries of the Five Nights at Freddy's series has a 92.3%, and there's no version with unfamiliar people removed, because literally not a single person said they didn't know what FNAF was, not even as a joke. That's
My
shockingly
God.
well behaved for this community. My only guess for why around 8% of people said that these aren't
That's shocking. I just caught that shit. Did you say that's shockingly well behaved for this community? That's funny.
mascot horror games is that a lot of people seem to consider mascot horror to be a genre designed with young people in mind, basically kids on the internet, and the original FNAF games might be too dark in their tone to fall into that. That, or maybe some people are so used to free roam fetch quest games that FNAF is excused because of its unique gameplay where you sit still for most of it. I'm really not too sure. Funnily enough, the Steel Wool FNAF entries, so games like Security Breach and Help Wanted, have a lower but still very high score of 89.9%
Lower?
or 91.4%. The reason for this drop is, I think, because there isn't really an attempt at spotlighting a single mascot, but instead there is almost equal attention put towards a much larger cast of characters. FNAF 1's mascot is undeniably Freddy, even though there are other enemies.
Weird to
Security
me.
Breach's mascot could be Glamrock Freddy.
Because, I mean, like, even if they're not highlighting one mascot, which I think he just said, everyone's a mascot. So what would it matter how many mascots are being highlighted in the horror, if I heard that correctly?
Or Vanny, or even Gregory or Vanessa if you go with the meta definition. Glamrock Freddy is probably the biggest player, but does he even count if he's a good guy? Just some suggestions, but 90% is still a pretty obvious.
I mean, he's possessed, so that's a horror aspect. That counts.
Neighbor being a mascot horror game,
I think he's possessed.
40.2 or 41.5%.
Okay, thank you. That shit is not a mascot horror game. It's a horror game. It's an indie horror game. That is not a mascot horror game. That is a game about some kid who goes inside of his neighbor's house, like, and finds creepy shit in there. Like that's it.
Responders. Actually, this is a good time to add something. I want you all to go to Google Images.
Hell, it's more of a puzzle game than a horror game anyway.
Tier list. You'll see a bunch of results from Reddit threads, tier maker, and YouTube videos. Go through them, and I swear every single one includes Hello Neighbor. Not only that, but nobody is saying in the comments that Hello Neighbor doesn't count as mascot horror. I honestly think most people deep down, subconsciously and instinctively accept this game as mascot horror. It just feels like a mascot horror game, doesn't it? It fits right
really
in.
Don't.
Next to FNAF and Tattletail and Bendy. But here we are, only 40% of people here say that it's mascot horror, which is still decently high, to be honest.
This
game has a mascot.
It just don't fit in that realm,
Coyote,
in my opinion.
whatever the fuck. But it's not actually about a mascot. So maybe I was right about 40% of people having the meta definition. Baldi's Basics is a fantastic one because it is genuinely so cleanly divided. There were moments when the survey was still live where it was
48.4
50-50 difference, but the final result is that 47.9%, or actually 49.4% of people consider it mascot horror. Like I said earlier, it's more likely that the majority of people would consider this game mascot horror if the game scared more people. But
I don't know, because I'm going by definition, not by like if it scares people. If I gotta say Baldi's Basic is a mascot horror game, no, it's just like Hello Neighbor. Like, what's happening is a teacher in a school, not like a restaurant or a cartoon studio. A teacher in a school is running around chasing you, and that's it. You just grab notebooks. That's well, okay. I'm not gonna talk about the gameplay, but like, yeah, you're getting chased by a teacher. He's not like tied to a company. He's tied to a school.
Let's just stick with.
He's not the face of a company.
There's a new question to ask here, and that's: are we playing a game within a game with Baldi's? The game presents itself as a 90s-inspired edutainment parody, but there isn't actually a second layer presented anywhere. It's not like we play as a guy who finds Baldi's Basics in their attic. No, we are literally playing the edutainment game. We are playing Baldi's Basics. If you consider
Baldi endless
to be a
mode
mascot of Baldi's Basics, you're only saying that he's the mascot of the game we are playing, which could then be applied to games like Hello Neighbor and Granny. I hope that makes some amount of sense. It's just something to think about. Tattletail brings us back to more familiar territory.
Tattletail, that's a mascot horror game.
Or around 90% of familiar people say that it is mascot horror. This is interesting because Tattletail is quite possibly an example of a mascot horror where the mascot in question, baby talking Tattletail, is not actually the primary threat in the game. In almost all other cases, the mascot, in both definitions, is the main enemy, or at least something that can kill you. But in Tattletail,
oh my God,
it's
I forgot about that game with the dog.
As the threat once you actually play the game. Tattletail is just an annoyance that triggers her. This shouldn't really make a difference either way, but it's the first of its kind on this list. Next is My Friendly Neighborhood, which I am surprised to see had a lot of people who were not familiar with it. Maybe I overestimated how much reach it had on places like YouTube. For me, this game was absolutely everywhere when it was released. Anyway, It's basically a Muppet parody of Resident Evil.
But I low-key forgot about it too.
It's a survival horror, but a lot of people
Which that's no insult to the dev. I just low-key forgot about this game. Like, this is the first time I've heard about it in years. Like, I think one day I was supposed to play it, and then I just like completely forgot because other things happened. Like,
it's scary, so that might have had an impact when it's 75.4%, originally 51.3% acceptance rate as mascot horror. If you look up this game online, you will see countless pictures of Norman, a cartoony puppet character.
Actually,
he is plastered everywhere in the game itself and in its marketing. He has a bold design, and I'm 99% sure he is literally the mascot of a TV show in the game's universe called My Friendly Neighbor.
Yeah, he's definitely a
This
mascot
game has
horror
another
game then, yeah.
interesting quality
Actually.
to it though, and that is that Norman, and most of the other Muppet enemies, is not a big single character like Huggy Wuggy in Poppy Playtime. There are dozens of him in the location, maybe hundreds if you play for long enough. For some
I was about
people,
to say, why did
games are
Dawko just appear
disqualified
behind
from
my
mascot
face
horror
cam?
definition if they primarily feature hordes of enemies. But what if the hordes are just clones of the mascot? Is that the factor that made a quarter of respondents say that this game isn't mascot horror? Or was it just because it's not scary enough to qualify as horror at all, in their eyes? Maybe I should have let people add their own notes to each of these. Slender, the 8
Probably.
Pages, is an example of a game on this list that predates Five Nights at Freddy's, which is a game that most people consider to be the origin, or at least an extreme catalyst, in the mascot horror trend.
I don't think I've ever played
Slender came
OG
out
Slender
2
on the
years before
channel.
FNAF 1, and though most people
I
don't
should.
instinctively think of this game when mascot horror is brought up, it is a popular indie horror
PewDiePie,
game with a
oh my
distinct
God.
face attached to it, or I suppose a lack of face. 17.9% or 18.5% of respondents say that this game is mascot horror. Slender has some unique qualities, like the fact that its antagonist is based on pre-existing material, a creepypasta made in 2009.
Yeah, bro, it's just a
and the shitload of fan
creepypasta.
art that
It
existed
ain't no
at that
mascot
time.
horror game.
And also, Slender's mascot in question is not at all stylized. He has a pretty iconic design, but he's not cartoony like the neighbor. So maybe some people with the in-universe definition believe that the neighbor counts, while Slenderman doesn't, because his design is somewhat appealing to children. I guess we'll learn more about this thinking when we get to Granny, which is a similar game with a similar style of enemy. Doki Doki Literature Club is
Oh,
undeniably
God.
a horror game, one of the most disturbing in this list I would say, but it has a cheerful outward appearance. It resembles a visual novel with dating elements, and is fronted by 4 human girls, with more emphasis put on Monica in some marketing material, since she has a more important presence in the game once you play it. 15.7%.
Doesn't she like switch the game after each playthrough? I forgot.
This game mascot horror. Obviously, these character designs do not resemble anything in a kids' entertainment venue, so it's safe to say that they do not fit the first in-universe mascot definition. But why do so many of the meta-definition people put this game as an exception? I think there are 2 potential reasons. The first being that DDLC's gameplay is unlike anything else in the genre. You could even argue that it isn't even a game at all. And the second being that the effort put into making Monica and her class it isn't even a game at all. And the second being that the effort put into making Monica and her classmates.
I thought that was like a joke about the Monica situation, but never mind.
Mascot for the game in our world.
I think that was an
has
actual argument.
0 horror influence. I imagine if the game was exactly the same, but the game's marketing and presentation was not so apprehensive about its scariness, more people would consider it mascot horror. And at this point, some of you might be asking, are the requirements of mascot horror referring to things outside of the game itself? And to those who believe in the meta definition, yes, I suppose they are. The difference between a character and a mascot is presentation. Bear in mind, there are plenty of other genres or labels that have nothing to do with gameplay or setting, and are instead about how the game is treated or created by its developers, like shovelware and gacha.
The hell is
live
shovelware?
service. And the most obvious one should be indie. Next is Duck Season, which is a VR game about a
Oh,
kid
Duck
playing
Season,
on a
that's
retro
what this
game
is
console
called.
while the mascot of a Duck Hunt parody game tries to kill him by entering the real world, basically. It's very creative and a rare example
That's creepy
of a
as
sit and
hell.
survive game that is clearly inspired by FNAF in some small ways, but it is still functionally entirely original. Anyway, 64.1% of respondents, or 75.5% of those in the know, say that this game is mascot horror. I mean, it's a horror game about a person in a mascot costume, and I would say the dog.
Can you imagine seeing that in like real life? That'd be scary as hell.
In our world as well. It's even a parody and a corruption of something nostalgic and innocent, which a lot of people added in their description of the genre. I am genuinely not sure why a quarter of people has said that this doesn't count. My only guess is because it doesn't feature the typical chase sequences and other trendy gameplay, or maybe because the mascot design or its presentation is too off-putting on the surface to appeal to younger fans.
Getting
I
shot
think
down
this
by
is
a
bizarre,
helicopter is
but the
crazy.
consensus seems to still be that it's a mascot horror game, so let's move on. I cannot for the life of me find any information about when Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, originally Spooky's House of Jumpscares, began development, but it was released only months after Five Nights at Freddy's 1, and is presented as a sort of parody of the indie horror games that have been
It was a long
trending at
time
the
ago.
like Vanish, Slender, SCP Containment Breach, maybe Amnesia. I included it in this list because the game itself absolutely has a mascot in the titular Spooky the Ghost. 17.6% of people, 23.5% adjusted, believe that this game is mascot horror. So even though it's presented like a goofy and cartoony parody on the surface, like Baldi's Basics, a good quarter of respondents...
The reason I just kind of like visibly cringed right there was because that sign just scared the shit out of me, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit that. Like, I don't know why that just scared me. I'm a little mad.
...consider it scary and mascot-y.
Like, if you just go back and look at my face, you can see like I tried to like not scream. Like, what the fuck?
Spooky is not a mascot.
Oh my god.
In the game's universe, bear in mind. She's just a ghost haunting a
Too
location.
jumpy, man. You two's maybe too jumpy.
Maybe enough to convince people that she resembles a brand mascot, though. Garten of Banban is a game about a kindergarten inhabited by giant colourful creatures that are only really described as mascots of the location. I have no idea if they are costumes, robots, genetic experiments, aliens.
I mean, if they call them mascots, there's gotta be mascot horror, I guess.
I don't talk to anyone about this game. Regardless, like I said, the Steam page for the game refers to the characters as mascots, and the game is almost loudly and proudly labelled as a mascot horror game practically everywhere. So it makes sense that 89.3% or 93.6% of people say that it falls in the mascot horror category. I can't even be bothered to think about why some people don't consider this mascot horror. I'll be honest, this game's inclusion in the survey doesn't serve much of a purpose. Okay, here's another very interesting one. Granny has a 29.3% or 30%.
Yeah, it's just about an old lady who chases you, right?
As mascot horror in this survey. About a third of people considered a game about this to fit into the mascot horror genre. Granny is undeniably the mascot of her own game, and she is unapologetically plastered all over the place, with even merchandise of her design being made at some point.
Oh god.
But there's no way in hell anyone thinks Granny resembles a literal mascot in the world of her game. Right? She's a presumably
if I hear Discord one more time, I'm gonna lose it.
Building a baseball bat.
Discord scaring the hell out of me with these noises.
In that sense at all. And this isn't a case of her being in a stylized, cartoony art style like The Neighbor. No, Granny is fucking horrific.
Very fucking horrific.
Nostalgic appeal, but over 30% of you think her game is mascot horror. And I'm emphasizing this because of what happened earlier. Remember, only about 18% of people consider Slender to be mascot horror. So, what exactly is the difference in presentation or theme between Granny and Slender? I have a feeling people were more hesitant to call Slender a mascot horror game simply because of its legacy, because it's older than FNAF, has more history, is more influential than basically any mascot horror game. But that really shouldn't be a deciding factor in a game's genre or how it's labelled, should it? A 10% difference isn't massive, but it caught my eye. That's still over 100 people who are treating the two games differently. I've seen some people say that grandmothers are a concept, or a character, I suppose, that children are familiar with, and Granny distorts this into something scary in the same way FNAF corrupts animatronics, and Bendy corrupts cartoons.
I don't know about that one. It's a weird way to look at it.
With this line of reasoning, I can see how Slender wouldn't fit into the same definition.
Yeah.
I can understand how this conclusion could be made.
It's an interesting line of thinking, but I don't know about all that.
But I don't understand how it has anything to do with mascots.
Yeah.
You are not describing a thing that should be called
what the
mascot
fuck is
horror.
that?
This concept sounds like it should have its own name. Like,
I barely played the updated versions of Granny. Can she turn into a fucking spider? What the fuck was that? I'm not rewinding that either. That looked horrifying. Like,
Defacement horror.
I don't want to see what she looks like when she mutates her body.
Or maybe just a trope called Childhood Ruined or something like that. The final game in the survey is Amanda the Adventurer, which is the one I'm
That's a mascot game.
familiar with. But 74.1%
yeah,
or 85.3% of well-versed respondents say that this game is mascot horror, which is pretty high considering the titular character is just a human child. That being said, Amanda the Adventurer is a pretty obvious parody of Dora the Explorer. The game has you play VHS tapes.
I haven't seen Dora in years, man. Oh my god.
To solve escape room-esque puzzles in the real world, which Amanda is able to interact with in supernatural ways. Amanda is undoubtedly the mascot of this game in a meta sense, and it's also safe to say she's the mascot of the media that you're watching in the game's universe. When I look at the given definitions of mascot horror provided by the people who said that this game doesn't count, I would say that the game does, in fact, fit most of them without any problem. It would seem like, with a lot of these people, there's some kind of
she's from a cartoon,
against
right?
humans being considered in-universe mascots. If Amanda wore clown makeup or dressed like a pirate, would she be considered a mascot? If the game was exactly the same but Amanda was a chicken, would we have an extra 10% of people saying that the game is mascot horror? I mean, it seems like Wooly, the Boots stand-in, who is literally a cartoon sheep and functions as a mascot for the TV show and game almost as much
and a part-time victim,
wasn't enough to convince 15% of respondents that the game has a qualifying mascot. Plus, in real life, tons of mascots are just people anyway. Mr. Monopoly, Colonel Sanders, Super Mario. It wouldn't be weird to call Dora the Explorer the mascot of her show, or even one of Nickelodeon. Personally, I think excluding human mascots from the genre is bizarre and unnecessary, if that's really what some people are doing.
Homer Simpson, Peter Griffin.
That was the last specific game mentioned on the survey.
There's a lot of human-type mascots.
Mascot horror game they would consider their favourite, and I suppose, somewhat unsurprisingly,
Timmy Turner?
Alright,
let me shut up.
Said some variation of Five Nights at Freddy's. There were some very interesting inclusions though, like Showdown Bandit, which is a game whose mascot is actually the protagonist.
That's a callback. Showdown Bandit? I've heard nobody talk about that in years.
In some people's definition, the mascot in question must be an antagonist, especially one that constantly stalks the player or acts like a villain. The vast majority of other submissions were of games already on my survey, but something caught my eye. 3 people said that Alien Isolation was their favourite game that could be considered mascot horror, though one of them notes that this would fall into the less common, broader definition of the genre. I've noticed that Alien Isolation often comes up as an extreme example of a horror game with a consistent face to it, often used to make the meta-definition of mascot horror sound ridiculous or contradictory. Oh, if Granny and Hello Neighbor count as mascot horror because they are mascots for their own...
I don't know. I think Alien Isolation just kind of counts as sci-fi horror. Like, it's just textbook alien futuristic shit. Like, you got the alien robot futuristic type of crazy AI type of shit. That's where Alien Isolation falls in. I can see why they say it, because the xenomorph is like all over toys and fucking shirts and stuff, but it's like, that's in our world more. It's not in their world. It's like, he's not tied behind a company or anything like that. I don't know.
Games, then that means
maybe I'm just weird.
Isolation counts, and that does sound weird after 5+ years of Freddy and Bendy and Poppy and Baldi. But if you think about it, is it that ridiculous? It is a horror game with an obvious mascot after all. Or is that kind of definition just too broad to even serve a purpose? Language changes over time, and on the internet this process can certainly be accelerated. Trends and slang do not stick around in their original states for long. However, to me, it has felt like the expectations and examples of this genre have transformed in only a few years, and in a way that might have been done...
I know it's completely unrelated, but this scene will never be the scariest shit ever. Like, bro, just like a 6+ foot monster coming out of the damn dark, and its face is covered in shadow.
Have transformed.
Then, like, when more light hits it, you just see dark ass eyes and teeth and drool because it wants to eat you so bad. Oh God, Huggy Wuggy was like done so well in this chapter. Sorry, unrelated. Keep going, Kane.
Few years, and in a way that might have been done, dare I say it, by mistake. Slang and terminology that originates on the internet doesn't typically change due to a misunderstanding in their meaning. The words themselves change, but the meaning doesn't. Lame becomes cringe, becomes mid. Homepage becomes feed, becomes FYP. Mascot horror appears to have changed meaning in a fairly significant way in the zeitgeist of the indie horror space without changing the term itself. And again, this has happened in only a few years, so the next thing to explore is the origin. Where did this term come from, and what did it mean back then? Can we even find this kind of data?
The origin.
Yes, we can. It's not too difficult. But to really get things in order, Know Your Memes page for Mascot Horror, oh look, there I am, credits this reply in a thread on 4chan's V board as the first known relevant instance of the words mascot horror game appearing on the internet in that order. I would argue this is not actually referring to or attempting to coin the name of a genre or trend. This person is simply saying that Five Nights at Freddy's has a mascot, which they actually compared to slasher movie icons like Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. It's already worth noting that those characters are only mascots in a meta sense, and not in the literal in-universe sense. This person recognises that even in 2016, FNAF was a horror series that stood out for having a recognisable character at its core. With all of this being said, I would not say that this is the origin of the term mascot horror, but I think it's interesting that this example, though it lacks a proper definition, compliments FNAF for having a recognisable mascot in our world, without giving any credit to the fact that Freddy is a corruption of something friendly, nostalgic and recognisable.
A huge corruption.
The actual origin of the term mascot
a ghost.
Horror. Most people who bother to look into this can comfortably agree that it was coined by John Wolfe, a YouTuber who has been making Let's Plays and analysis videos for over a decade now, almost exclusively in the horror game space. For a long time, he was known as harshly critical and even had
Bro, I just learned some John Wolfe lore. I didn't even know. I thought that was like John Wolfe's channel's name the whole time.
respectfully, referring
Oh my
to his
God.
rigorous and uncompromising reviews of the games he played on his channel. I do think it's important to note that John isn't just a YouTuber who plays whatever is viral and ends the video with, "Okay, that was fun, see you in the next one." No, he genuinely admits when he thinks the game he's playing is shit, or at least he did back in 2018, which is when he made this Twitter thread. With the rampant success of Baldi's Basics, it further proves we're in the era of mascot horror. The only horror games that achieve widespread popularity are ones with a clear mascot. Baldi, Granny, Bendy, The Neighbor, Freddy Fazbear, etc. We're still getting great atmospheric titles.
Alright, back to it. Sorry for the pause.
Unforgiving, A Northern Hymn, Stories Untold, Welcome to the Game 2, Close Your Eyes. But
Welcome to the game. That's a callback too.
Of course, there have been popular characters in the past. What I'm trying to get at is that there's a greater emphasis today on horror game character brandability. He also replied to some people with additional thoughts on this trend. I'm talking about a clear standout mascot, one that you can put on t-shirts and mugs, much like what Bendy has turned into. Saying that everything has a central figure / idea / concept is overgeneralizing. I'm talking about a singular standout mascot character. It's a new thing for horror games in particular. Fatal Frame had a cast of many ghosts, Resident Evil had a cast of many zombies, Outlast had a cast of many inmates. There's a clear contrast between those and what we're seeing in more recent years. This is great data.
Damn.
Not only is this the first serious example of mascot horror being coined as a genre or a trend, but it's also a very clear and concise definition of what it is, with examples of games that do and do not fit into it by an influential person in the horror game space who can easily be credited as the source of the terminology. John Wolfe is describing mascot horror as horror games that reach an audience by having an identity that revolves around a clear mascot. Mascot horror, in this definition, may be more comfortably achieved with literal child-friendly mascot characters, but it is absolutely not a requirement or even mentioned as a running theme anywhere in John's description, which is proven by Granny being listed as one of the first examples. It's right there. Granny is a mascot, and her game is mascot horror, because the game's presentation relies on a big memorable character to catch people's eyes instead of a vague threat like hordes of nameless zombies. It doesn't matter that she's not a corruption of child-friendly media. Even at this point, people respond to John claiming that this isn't worth being considered a genre because it has always been a thing, or even that every major media release has a mascot, which is super frustrating to read because John outright lists examples of horror games that don't fit into the genre and focus more on an atmosphere, like Unforgiving, A Northern Hymn, and Stories Untold. Do you remember those games when they were big on YouTube? It's very possible that you don't, which I suppose proves John's point. Indie games with clear mascots tend to do better, in that they last longer and they make more of an impact. It's safe to say that it took a while for the term to become mainstream, but John continued to refer to iconic and marketable villains in indie games as mascots, which without a doubt would have had some kind of impact on the vocabulary of his hundreds of thousands of viewers, whether subconscious or not. In terms of what immediately followed, I can add that a week after his Twitter thread, John played an update of Baldi's Basics and claimed that Baldi was designed to be a great mascot for the game to put on YouTube thumbnails and whatnot. A month and a half later, he again says in a pinned comment of another Baldi's video that the game's flashy mascots and jump scares appeal to kids. Despite these videos being about a viral game and on a popular channel, for at least 2 years the label was almost exclusively used by John and maybe his own side of the indie horror community.
That's crazy. You just make up a whole
It
term
wasn't
of
until
horror.
John played Poppy Playtime in October 2021 that mascot horror really started to grow as a popular term for these kinds of games. You can start to see some people on websites like Twitter mention the genre casually, and then boom, a tweet on the 3rd of December 2021 by Claypot Blue pops up and gets thousands of likes, presumably tens of thousands of views, and in the replies a bunch of people are acting like they've been using this terminology for ages. They haven't. This is absolutely the first viral mention of mascot horror on a social media platform.
Did Kane really search up their Twitters just to see if they've been using that for a long time? Holy shit. Was that like their names in the search
Followed
bars?
up on the original tweet, which also criticized mascot horror games as hungry for money, with a clarification that specifically brings up Poppy Playtime. This is just a guess, but I imagine that Claypot Blue heard about Poppy Playtime from a friend, searched for a playthrough on YouTube, watched John's video from a month and a half prior, and then made his tweets based on what John called the game. I am confident that this is where
Team
the split in
Fortress
definitions
2
occurred. John Wolfe's original 2018 thread gives a clear definition of the genre and multiple examples of mascot horror that include games without literal in-universe mascots, but for whatever reason, his Poppy Playtime video doesn't.
This appears to be the latest entry in the what I would call mascot horror genre.
He cites games like Five Nights at Freddy's, Bendy and the Ink Machine, and Baldi's Basics, but not games like Granny or Hello Neighbor. This more contextless version of mascot horror may have led people like Claypot Blue to believe that the terminology referred to the corruption of in-universe mascot characters, or at the very least, a ton of people who saw this viral tweet definitely came to that conclusion. Neither John nor Claypot did anything wrong in their observations, but the nickname for the trend, by itself, had hundreds of people associating it strictly with the literal mascot games, like Five Nights at Freddy's, Happy's Humble Burger Farm, Tattletail.
Happy's Humble Burger Farm? What the hell is that?
Even outright describing the genre as meaning a game with literal mascots, or with a child-friendly character design being distorted into something frightening. A video uploaded by Crofteria in June 2022 also specifically describes mascot horror as meaning children's mascots being turned into killers, showing a paragraph from a website that I don't recognise, maybe TV Tropes or something like that. Crofteria outright says the concept requires the mascot to initially be innocent as if created for kids, which, as we know, is not what the original definition was describing. I'm not claiming that this small channel made a major difference in the public's perception of the term. I just think it's interesting that the information she was able to collect for her video was so strict about the genre being about children's mascots. But the reason I still call this a split in definitions and not a change or evolution in it is because some people, like Synapse, oh look, they follow me, knew even back in January 2022 that mascot horror was just supposed to mean popular games that focus on at least one iconic villain, a mascot for the project. They even give Slender as an example, and they were not alone.
Success of
Okay,
Slender.
they were pretty much alone. As we now know, about 40% of the community nowadays seem to accept that mascot horror means horror games with a clear mascot, and not necessarily those that feature kid-friendly characters. It's pretty much impossible to know whether this number has increased or decreased since the term became mainstream.
That's actually insane. Like, this is kind of why I'm really like geeking out over this video, because like, yeah, not a lot of people really like talk about this type of topic, and it's like really cool to see what other people like think about. And I really like how Kane really put together like a whole like data thing, like it's like a whole science experiment and shit. It's really cool.
In early 2022, but get this, the massive surge of people believing the genre means literal kid-friendly mascots was apparently enough to even change John Wolfe's mind on a label that he coined. That's right, John Wolfe's original report of mascot horror makes it very clear that he's referring to all kinds of popular games that have an identity that leans on a clear mascot in a meta sense, and not necessarily about literal children's mascots turning evil, though they can obviously be included. We know this because he includes projects like Granny, which is a game about a character who is only a mascot in our world, not in hers. But in February 2023, almost 5 years after his thread, and just over a year after Claypot's viral tweet, John uploaded a video called The Ups and Downs of Mascot Horror. The intro of the video gives a rundown of mascot horror, describing it as a genre where you take a friendly-looking mascot, often in a setting aimed at children, and the expectations of the design are
and then throw a bunch of ghosts in it.
Atmosphere. So while John's original definition is about games needing a catchy character to put in the thumbnails, the definition in this video is now about literal mascot characters. So this new definition should discount Granny, right? Well, 1 minute into the video he shows footage of Granny and then doesn't say anything about it. For the entire 25-minute video, by the way. But he does say that Slender, the 8 pages, does not count as mascot horror because the character design was intended from the start to be creepy. What the fuck? Why did you give Granny as an example in 2018, John? Is it because Granny is a fucked up version of a grandmother, and grandmothers are usually nice? Isn't the Slender Man just a fucked up version of a man in a suit?
I don't even know what the hell Slender Man is, man. I really don't.
I obviously don't think this should matter either way, but I don't understand how John's own definition of his own terminology has changed to exclude games like this. Hundreds of people have accepted that the label refers to games with a clear mascot to help it reach widespread acclaim, which would totally include Slender. John says that mascot horror's first example is Five Nights at Freddy's. And if we are now going with the literal definition, he might be right. I can't think of any significant horror games about literal kids mascots from before 2014. But going by his original 2018 definition, it would not be right, because not only do we have Slender, as I think at least an obvious example, But we also have I'm Scared, and perhaps the most overlooked
The
example
hell is I'm Scared?
Oni. These are horror games with mascots.
The
Not
hell
games
is...
with a cast of many ghosts or a cast of...
You know what, I've seen that other game you just said with the big purple dude in it. Yeah, I think I've seen a gif of them like opening a door or something in first person. Yeah, that game looks scary.
Many zombies or a cast of many inmates. Big, bold,
Yeah, that shit.
recognizable villainous
That's
threats
creepy.
that completely encompass their game's public image and identity. Faces, designs that are everywhere on their marketing, everywhere on YouTube thumbnails. If
God,
they were released
old
today
Corey
in the
video.
current indie space, they could totally sell merch for the games too. This is not the definition that most people hold, but it's a definition that at least some do, and I actually think it may be the more suitable version of it.
Choo choo
And
Charles.
not just because I'm so dumbfounded by John seemingly changing his mind about it over 4 years later. But before I move on to my own opinion on the matter, I want to add one more thing to the timeline of events.
What's
John
happening
Wolfe
to that
talks about
bot?
the idea of corrupting a nostalgic character design into something scary at the very end of his Duck Season playthrough, which was in September 2017, even earlier than his Twitter thread by almost a year. He essentially compliments Duck Season by saying, "It
I know, another unrelated thing, but Jesus Christ, I haven't seen an HTC... I haven't seen my HTC Vive since, like, what, 2017, 2016? It's crazy to see
kind of
crazy to
reminds me
see
a bit
one
of
being
Tattletail,
used.
in that it took something nostalgic from the 90s, and it kind of turned it into a source of horror. It took a familiar mascot like Tattletail did with the Furby that's aimed at children and is seemingly innocent and made it threatening. Obviously John uses the word mascot here, but in this context he is definitely referring to it literally, and not only is he talking about literal mascots in a game's world, but he's referring to distorted parodies of real mascots that exist in our world, being the Duck Hunt dog and Furby. And we know this because he outright says familiar mascot. This clip is short, but I think it's obvious that he's noting a creative choice in a game's aesthetic and is not talking about the identity of the game or how it's marketed. John is identifying a trend here that is different, but definitely nested inside the one he made a thread about a year after this. I think it's entirely possible that since 2017, John has noticed two trends existing concurrently. This trend about corrupting children's characters into something sinister, which he noticed with games like Duck Season and Tattletail, and then also, a little later on, a bigger trend about horror games relying on mascots to push their image, which he noticed because of games like Baldi's Basics, Hello Neighbor and Granny, which are games that aren't about literal mascots in their universes. And of course, super popular games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Poppy Playtime fit both definitions. And if this is true, then my assumption is that in 2023, when mascot horror had become such a widely used term, John made his video but was influenced by both the now very common interpretation of the word and also perhaps his own 2017 identification of a slightly different trend about literal children's characters. Regardless, the two big definitions are different, and now the community is cracked in half, or maybe cracked into 1/4 and 3/4, or cracked into 40% and 60%.
Or cracked in the 4s,
Crack.
5s, and 6.
Crack has a nice sound to it, actually. Let's use that for the next
Fractured.
I'm going
Crack.
to present my own stance, a proposal you could
And it just
say
turns into a whole
via
drugs
5 pillars
essay.
that spell out the word crack, because it is funny. I think the publicly accepted definition of mascot horror should be reverted to John's original, broader 2018 version, and here is why.
Crack. Oh, wow,
The
okay.
first and most obvious reason, though perhaps a little subjective,
Very creative.
is that the genre's association with this more specific theme of literal mascots has very likely happened by mistake. When I say it's subjective, I mean some people may think that this is a natural evolution of the word and that maybe it's better or more appropriate for the community. But I think anyone who's been following along can pretty much accept that the term was invented to mean games with popular characters, no matter their design.
So
that carry
crazy
the
how he
game's
just runs
image
out of the window.
virality in online spaces. People read the word mascot in this newly popularized genre and assumed that it meant literal mascots because of what they were seeing on YouTube at the time. Poppy Playtime, My Friendly Neighborhood, Bendy and the Ink Machine, etc. There is a small but irritating feeling inside me begging for some kind of attempt at correcting this mistake. It just feels wrong, knowing that there are thousands of people who understand and expect something differently from the rest. And of course a part of me also accepts that it's been years and everyone should adapt to the current mainstream meaning, but we got here in the first place somehow, so maybe it can be repaired too, especially if so many still seem to agree with the original meaning.
Reputation.
Over 80% of respondents to my survey said that they felt like mascot horror had a reputation for being low quality or cheap, When I asked people to give their general thoughts on the genre, a massive amount of people called the genre stale, repetitive, lazy, with over 100 people claiming the genre was catering almost exclusively to children, and many people also defining the genre as having specific gameplay mechanics like chase sequences and fetch quests and linear stories, etc. At least 20 people also used the word slop, which is another number than I expected actually. My point is, I believe that this overwhelmingly poor reputation of mascot horror is very much tied to its public perception of being strictly about the exact same kind of shit all the time. When you exclude games like Slender and Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion and Doki Doki Literature Club, you're left with the expectation of a bunch of ugly, primary colour anthro characters in a big, dark location where you walk from one area to another to collect items and activate generators or whatever the fuck. There are developers in the indie gaming space who are rightly embarrassed of the label, like Hikita Dev, the creator of Ultrakill, who in 2023 promoted My Friendly Neighborhood by telling people, make no mistake, it's not mascot horror. Dude, it's a game about fucked up Muppets. The game literally has a U2s and a makeshift plushie of the character that appears on every Google image result of the game. The game has a mascot, and it's self-described as horror. I'm saying all of this because imagine if mascot horror did not appear as some kind of stain on the indie horror community. Imagine if indie devs understood that this genre, which is literally just the act of putting a lot of effort into a memorable character to represent your game, by the way, was in fact pioneered by iconic, trailblazing indie games like Ayo Oni and I'm Scared, and not by Rainbow Friends and Garten of Banban. I am genuinely suggesting that at least some portion of mascot horror's bad reputation comes from the label itself and its strict definition. I posit that broadening its meaning could make discussion of indie games more friendly online, and it could encourage developers to try contributing to the genre by making good horror games with good mascots, and then labeling the game as such without shame. It is possible.
Definitely possible.
Generally speaking, the purpose of the genre or label is to categorize different examples of media, to set expectations for viewers / listeners / players, and to make things easy to search for and share on platforms like YouTube, Spotify, and Steam. Essentially, they are keywords to associate to projects that are similar to each other. And as I think we've established, an uncountable amount of people lump together games like Granny and Baldi's Basics and Poppy Playtime, not just because they have identifiable, memorable mascots, but because they clearly have an extreme overlap of audiences. I'm not saying that a genre like this should be defined by what media its audience seems to have a focus on, otherwise Friday Night Funkin' and Fortnite would be mascot horror. I'm saying that
somebody was boxing up in that clip.
Excluding games from a wildly popular label like this just because they don't have a literal mascot in their game's universe feels backwards and redundant. People who enjoy games like Bendy and the Ink Machine are pretty likely to also enjoy games like Hello Neighbor and Baldi's Basics because they share the quality of having a memorable cast of characters that are fun to make fan art of, rather than a generic human protagonist surviving against hundreds of zombies. But if we went with the stricter definition of the label,
there ain't nothing generic about Leon Kennedy. Choose somebody else.
Because a lot of people would say that the Neighbor and Baldi don't count as mascots. But we all know, really, that these games feel very similar to each other. The exclusion serves no purpose. If we use the broader definition, not only could it help with the reputation of the trend, like I previously said, but it will be more functional for those who enjoy these kinds of games, and it will also likely expand their palette slightly by trying older and more experimental games that still fit the genre, like I'm Scared, Doki Doki, and Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. And I know that some of you are thinking that this kind of categorization will just end up including every horror game, and plenty of other people have told me this, but you are wrong. And I think you're wrong because of some form of survivorship bias. You've forgotten about the plethora of horror games that release without a mascot because they lack a mascot. You've been watching this video thinking about Huggy Wuggy and Jumbo Josh, but who is the mascot of Iron Lung, or Soma, or Crow Country, or Sons of the Forest, or Subnautica, or Holstein, or Phasmophobia?
I feel like such a loser because I've only played 3 of these games. I have Soma, but I never finished it. I think I have Crow Country, but I haven't got to it yet. Subnautica, I see his point. Sons of the Forest, I see his point too. I played that a little bit. And Phasmophobia, I definitely see his point too, because there's like many ghosts, not just one.
And if we're counting non-indie games, which we should be according to 80% of you, then who is the mascot of Silent Hill, or Prey, or Until Dawn, or Metro, or The Evil Within?
Sam's definitely the
remember,
mascot.
A mascot is not just a main character.
I'm only saying that because Sam is my favorite character, but for no other reason.
A villain who turns into a cult icon later, like Pyramid Head.
Purely nostalgia.
Or multiple characters sometimes, that a game's entire identity and public image truly revolves around, especially to help it reach a larger audience. This method of presenting a game has existed in horror for ages, maybe even multiple decades, but it has only become so insanely prevalent since Five Nights at Freddy's. I will go over examples later, but I think you get the idea.
Consistency.
This is, I think, maybe the most objective part of this entire proposal. This will take some explaining, but the gist of it is that there are already plenty of other genres and labels that exist in entertainment media with mascot in their names. They have nothing to do with literal in-universe children's mascots and have everything to do with just iconic representations of products and brands. In fact, if Mascot Horror is to refer to literal mascots, it would be the only one to do so, from what I can tell. Take a look at this. The TV Tropes page for the categorization of mascot villain. Many series have their own mascot, in-universe or otherwise. Whether they are big bads, dragons, ineffectual sympathetic villains, or just the humble mascot mook is not needed. What
Mascot
distinguishes
mook
this is that the series mascot is evil. This is basically describing the trope of an antagonist in a series becoming so prominent that they end up representing the product. An evil figure symbolizes the movie, or game, or entire franchise, and of course there is no requirement that the mascot in question be a literal kid-friendly mascot in the property's universe. Funnily enough, if we scroll down on this page, it says, as a general rule, this is extremely common with horror. A horror movie franchise will usually see its villain/monster turn into its most recognizable character. For video games, the mascot horror subgenre is built around this trope. Well now, isn't that interesting? TV Tropes, which is a website that I'm sure a ton of you guys use, seems to agree that the mascot horror game genre is built around very recognizable characters, and is not at all restricted or even based on literal children's mascots. That is, until you click the link. Instead of masses of enemies, an intangible terror or an actively horrific threat make the main terror be a recognizable corporeal character or group of characters. Yes, oh my god, what a fantastic start. Who, with some defanging, could easily be the mascots of a children's media franchise and often are in universe. What? No, that's
What
not
the
a
hell?
requirement, that's a different thing entirely. Surely this should be its own trope? You already said on the mascot villain page that mascot horror is just about very recognizable characters. There was zero requirement or even emphasis on literal children's media. I appreciate that the characters being in-universe is mentioned as only happening often, and not always, but this description still disqualifies stuff like Granny, which isn't right. This mascot essentially serves as a mascot for the game too, contrasting greatly with the dark, atmospheric cover art that most horror games have. Essentially is a bit of a loose word for what is definitely meant to be the exact definition of the trope. In conjunction with this, add further allusions to the player's childhood by having references to recognizable childhood media. Okay, this is getting painful now. And again, this is the only example I can find of a trope or genre with mascot in the name that is so often interpreted to be about in-universe children's media mascots. I can prove this with the perhaps even more influential genre of gaming, the mascot platformer. Yeah, we have platformer games, and then we have mascot platformers, which have the same kind of familiar gameplay and general themes, but they specifically feature an iconic main character, usually but not always very constant.
You know, with hearing hearing the word mascot being applied to so many genres, at this point I just say call it a fucking horror game or call it a platform. Mascot platform sounds so fucking weird.
And usually but not always an animal or fictional creature. The requirement is that the game's identity revolves around this one guy on the front cover of the game. And though TV Tropes doesn't have a page for this, maybe because so many platformers have an iconic mascot, but definitely not all of them, I promise that it is in fact a known existing genre/trend, and I can prove it with these. I don't know why people complain about mascot horror. How is it any different from mascot platformers like Mario or Crash or Spyro or Banjo? Mascot horror games are just the mascot platformers of the 2010s and 2020s. The 90s had mascot platformers. The mid-2010s to early 2020s have the mascot horror. Hell yeah, we're back in early 2022. Yeah, I didn't show you these earlier because they present such a great point by themselves. Some people, who I assume weren't super active in the indie horror game space at the time, immediately associated this new term, mascot horror, with mascot platformer. Mascot platformer is a very well recognised genre, and I would bet that at least some of the people who said on the survey that the genre refers to mascots in our world instinctively knew it was a term that can be compared to mascot platformer. In fact, I would even bet that a seasoned gamer like Wolfe was outright inspired, subconsciously or not, by this existing genre. Also, remember Claypot Blue, the person who is quite possibly responsible for the popularization of the literal definition of mascot horror? Even he recognises and has talked about mascot platformers. I noticed this when using Twitter's search function. I thought it was funny. But yeah, my point is that there already exists a massively recognised subgenre of games with mascot in the name that simply means a type of game with a recognisable character at the core of its presentation and identity. Just to drive this point home, TV Tropes recognises other mascot genres, like Mascot Racer,
Mascot Racer,
distinct and recognisable characters.
I must be late on the mascot terms, man.
There are also Mascot Fighter and Mascot RPG games, though they seem to have a requirement of pre-established characters. Regardless, none of these defined genres have any requirement or even any running trend of including characters who are mascots inside of their own worlds. They just represent their own products. I think I've made my point.
Kane.
I noticed that the 4 other sections I wrote spelled out CRAC and thought it would be good to add a 5th so that it correctly spells out an actual word, crack. So the 5th pillar of my proposal is Kane, which is my name. Change the definition of mascot horror back to meaning horror games whose identities revolve around an iconic character because Kane said so. Because my name is Kane.
Because Kane said
Carter,
so.
Creator of pop quiz. Let's assume now that the definition of mascot horror is as follows. A genre.
Yo, Kane, if I say play Pop Goes for 2 straight hours on stream, can I get a free Pop Goes arcade code?
Of horror games.
If I just sit down and say that, can I get one?
Around at least one
I'll sponsor you for free for 2 hours.
1. There can be multiple mascots for the game as long as they still function as iconic and memorable symbols for it. Examples of this could be Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, Doki Doki Literature Club, Poppy Playtime. 2. The mascot can be the protagonist. Examples: Showdown Bandit, The Bunny Graveyard, Franbo. 3. The game can predate Five Nights at Freddy's. Examples could be Slender the 8 Pages, Ayo Oni, I'm Scared.
This is giving me so many other horror games to play, though. Give me ideas for videos.
They qualify for this definition. This interpretation is definitely broader than you may be used to, but it doesn't encompass every horror game ever made. It does, however, include every game in the survey that I conducted. That's right, every one of them is a mascot horror game because they all have identities that revolve around iconic mascots. Their virality on the internet can be credited to their memorable character designs that spawned massive Let's Play videos, tons of fan art, and a lasting presence that means you and I still
Bendy
talk
is
about
coming
all
to
of
the
them
big
this day,
screen.
whether we actually like them or not. But what about Resident Evil 1? Not a mascot horror. Though Jill and Chris are cool characters and they pop up on some promotional material, the identity of the game is focused on the dangerous environment, its gritty presentation, and a pressing threat of lots of nameless zombies and monsters in general. Resident Evil 2. This game has a cult icon in Mr. X, a huge tyrant enemy. However, he is not treated as a mascot in the slightest. He is practically nowhere in the promotional material for this game. Instead, the game is again focused on a fairly generic zombie apocalypse vibe again, not mascot horror. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Yes, this game is mascot horror. It's maybe the most iconic example of a big studio making a horror game with an unmistakable mascot to push its image. Not only is Nemesis absolutely everywhere in the game's marketing material, but his name is in the fucking title of the game. It's his game. Silent Hill. You can work your way backwards with plenty of games.
I guess even after watching a whole hour of this, I still kind of consider, like, if we're going to call something a mascot horror game, it has to be something that's, like, in universe being pushed as, like, a mascot. Like, if fucking McDonald's had their own game for a mascot horror, like, Ronald McDonald, you know, better be the fucking problem of the game, you know? It better be Ronald McDonald because he's the mascot, I think, of McDonald's, if my information is not too fucking outdated. But, yeah, better, like, if Ronald McDonald was killing people and McDonald's put that in a horror game, it's a fucking mascot horror game, in my opinion. I don't know.
Asking who is this game's mascot? And
call me part of the problem, but I don't know. I think that's what it is.
For Silent Hill, for most people, would be Pyramid Head. But the game's image and general theme does not put much attention to this character, if any at all. He doesn't carry the game. Misery and lots of fog carries it. Not a mascot horror game. Though
Misery and lots of fog.
Silent Hill games feature a literal mascot character. Amnesia the Dark Descent. A lot of people, especially those who have never played it, associate this game with the design of the most common enemy, which has no actual name and is just referred to as Servant Grunt. But the game itself doesn't give this enemy
those things don't have a damn name, and I've seen them on PewDiePie's videos back in, like, what, 2010 or some shit? Jeez. Those things, like, make the game
For
famous.
attention beyond him.
I mean, just look how
appearing easily
scary they
often.
made
I think
them.
It's kind of coincidental.
They cooked
that
on that
can't become
design
more
just for it to
memorable
not have a
than
name?
enemies, because I
Damn.
can't find anything official that platforms him in a mascot-like way. I'll say not mascot horror. Alien Isolation. Some of you will hate to hear this, but this game is pretty objectively fitting the criteria. The game has plenty of enemies, but it revolves around the Xenomorph, an antagonist with an iconic design who cannot be killed and basically stalks the player indefinitely.
That's
The
odd to
alien
me.
is the mascot of the game. I understand if some people would prefer to pretend that this game doesn't count because the mascot existed in previous media or something like that, but it does fit. Sorry. Luigi's Mansion. Luigi is maybe the most iconic video game mascot that will appear in this video, but I think most
Y'all know I don't play about Luigi's Mansion. What? How the fuck is Luigi's Mansion a mascot? Huh?
people would agree that Luigi's Mansion is an action-adventure game with elements that are only inspired by horror, like ghosts and whatnot. This would be an extremely cheeky inclusion in a list of mascot horror games. I don't count it. Little
Yeah, I was
Nightmares.
about to say
This is
that's not no damn mascot horror game.
maybe the most difficult one to decide on. I'm not very familiar with this game, but it clearly has two prominent figures on a fair amount of its promotional material. Those
Little
being a character called
Nightmares?
Six, the one in the yellow
I
raincoat,
wouldn't
and
count it.
Mono, the one with the paper bag on his head.
I don't know. I'd probably count this shit as like a platform horror game, and I played all of them that's dropped.
However, the presentation of Little Nightmares does seem fairly focused on the big environments and the
Stealth
disturbing
platformer
enemies, of
horror
which there are
game.
many. You could argue that Six is the mascot of Little Nightmares, especially since an interpretation of her design is in the game's logo. Does the identity of Little Nightmares revolve around Six as a character? She doesn't talk, has no real personality or face, and there's even a spin-off game called Very Little Nightmares. In
Okay,
which
I
you
didn't play
play
that
as a
before.
completely different
What the
girl
hell?
in a yellow raincoat. That being said, I think Showdown Bandit is pretty obviously mascot horror, so maybe it's fair to say that Little Nightmares is as well. I'll say yes. If you consider this game to be horror, then it is mascot horror. But this is one I'm not 100% certain on, alright? SCP
no.
Containment Breach. This is another fairly early indie horror game. Often
Like,
put
I
alongside
don't know. Again, a company is in the in-game universe, and it has something as the face of it, and it chases you around the game. That is a mascot chasing you around in a fucking horror game. That's what that is.
classics like Slender and Amnesia.
I don't know. That's
The
how
most
I
memorable
feel.
character, if you can call it
I
that,
could be wrong.
is
I
a
always
statue
am.
with the catchy name SCP-173, or rather the original design of this character, which was based heavily on an art installation without permission. The design was changed due to copyright concerns, and respectfully, ain't nobody give a fuck about the new design. I would say that SCP-173's
Jesus.
original look is a pretty iconic figurehead in creepypasta culture in general, but it is not really treated like a mascot for the SCP Containment Breach game. It is one enemy of many, and they are all actually somewhat hidden from the audience until you play it. The game's identity revolves around a secret conspiracy vibe, monsters secretly kept in vaults, stuff like that. Not a mascot horror game. Sonic.exe. On the topic of games based on classic creepypastas, we have Sonic.exe. This is a mascot horror game. It doesn't matter that the game features a pre-existing character, or that it's an unofficial fan creation. I don't think anyone is arguing against Slendy Tubbies being mascot horror. It's a horror game with an extremely clear mascot. This particular version of Sonic is tied
I
specifically
don't know.
to
I don't know what to call that,
Sonic.exe,
if I gotta be honest.
the game or the original story. There's no argument here. To be honest, this game should actually count as mascot horror in the literal definition too, considering Sonic the Hedgehog is an innocent mascot who appeals to kids. Huh. At this point, I think you can use your judgment. If a game or a chapter of a game is definitely horror and it has at least one clear mascot which the game revolves around, then it's pretty safe to call it mascot horror. And if you're wondering what the first game that fits this definition might be, there are some interesting contenders. Clock Tower from 1996.
Clock
This is a
Tower.
point-and-click horror game from 1996, inspired by slasher movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th. The game features an antagonist called Scissorman, who never quite
Scissorman.
reached the same level of popularity as those iconic movie villains, but is still pretty clearly the mascot of this game and is pushed as an important, threatening serial killer character, though they had the tendency of using the same piece of artwork over and over.
Now, okay, this is my first time ever in my damn life seeing this game. I know damn well she does not think hiding up there is gonna stop those big ass pair of gardening clippers from getting her up there, right? Like, what? That is not a hiding spot. Like, if bro stops hunching over and stands up, I'm sure he would have fucking seen her up there.
I think this counts as mascot horror, though it would be even more blatant if the name of the game was simply Scissorman.
What is
Splatterhouse from
happening?
1988. This
I've heard of
is an arcade game
Splatterhouse.
from even before Clock Tower. The promotional material for this game, if you can even call it that, gives a bit of a strange first impression because though there are clearly a bunch of grunt monsters in the artwork, The presented hero, who is vanquishing them, also looks like a bad guy. This is Rick, a character who, from what I can tell, is completely innocent and only wears this mask because it is keeping him alive. It resurrects him or some shit, but this is definitely a survival game, and Rick, wearing the terror mask, is definitely its mascot. He's everywhere. The only question is whether it's a horror game, which is disputed by some, I guess, because Rick is more of a threat than the enemies. It's a beat-em-up, but plenty of people also do consider it a horror game, so I don't know. How interesting that such an early possible example of mascot horror has a protagonist as its mascot. I didn't think we'd find another one of those. Hunt the Wampus from 1973 or 1980. Hunt the Wampus, first of all, has nothing to do with Discord's ugly mascot character. It is a game that was originally released in 1973 as an entirely text-based adventure game about exploring procedurally generating mazes on an invisible dodecahedral grid. The aim of the game, essentially, is to kill the Wampus before he, or Bottomless Pit, kills you. This version of the game had no visuals, but the Wampus is in the title of the game and is a pretty threatening, looming threat. Still, not really good enough. Not yet. But the 1980 re-release of the game on the TI-99 changed things up. The Wampus is now visualized in a few forms, I guess, and so is the player character. You now visibly sneak around a maze and determine where the monster is so you can fire an arrow at him. This game is not necessarily scary to look at, but I can totally see how players in 1980 would consider this a mild horror experience, especially considering the Wampus has quite possibly the first video game jump scare of all time. That motherfucker looks like Nightmare Fredbear. For the hell of it, let's say that this is the first mascot horror game. And at this point in gaming history, few horror games existed, but if they did, their themes tended to be, in hindsight, pretty generic and safe. Ghosts and zombies and goblins, usually not original villains, or lone monsters with funny names like the Wampus.
Interesting. What about literal mascot horror games?
Does well, and the horror gaming community agrees with my points, especially with what I talk about in the crack section, then that's awesome. I would prefer that, obviously. But we have a new problem. The noted trend of horror games, especially indie games, being focused on child-friendly mascot characters in the form of twisted toys, puppets, costumes, animatronics, etc., absolutely does exist. It exists within, and extremely rarely maybe outside of, the mascot horror genre. It makes sense to categorize these games due to their related aesthetic choices. Earlier in the video, when I was talking specifically about Granny, I suggested that the concept of twisting the concept of familiar, nostalgic and friendly character designs should probably be given its own genre or label, something like defacement horror. I made that up on the spot, and though it makes technical sense, it's not super catchy. And I've sat here trying to think of other suitable names for this trend, but it is quite difficult to think of a word that covers all of these kinds of cartoony products while excluding games like Granny and Hello Neighbor. I've racked my brain, asked friends and family, and the best ideas I can come up with, on top of defacement horror, are plush horror.
Plush horror.
Fairly catchy, and it's referring to cartoony or fluffy character designs, but it might feel weird to call something like CistReactZ plush horror.
Yeah.
And the character designs are famously
FNAF 4 is
shiny.
plush horror.
Toy box horror. This has a ring to it, and it totally fits games like Playtime, Tattletail, Garten of Banban, and most Five Nights at Freddy's games, but it feels a little out of place attached to Bendy and the Ink Machine. Toon horror. Games like Bendy and the Ink Machine and even Baldi's Basics would now fit a term like this. I also think it still fits games like FNAF and Playtime, simply because the character designs
probably
are
not
basically
FNAF.
cartoony. It is a little infantile, but maybe that's a good thing.
Maybe
Main issue is that
sci-fi
games
horror?
Like The Joy
I
of
don't know.
Creation
For
are
FNAF.
currently defined as mascot horror because they feature literal mascots, but it doesn't sound right to call T-Jock a toon horror game.
Nah.
Or maybe it does.
I just realized me calling FNAF sci-fi horror does not fucking work. That more kind of fits the like Alien Isolation. I don't know what to. If we're not calling FNAF mascot horror, we're just making up names. I don't really know what to call FNAF. Animatronic horror. Fuck it, mascot horror. You might as well just call it mascot horror. It just fits.
I mean, it's still a game about big animatronic animals, fucked up as they may be. Nostalgia horror. This term could encompass most of the games with literal mascots.
Maybe nostalgia horror for
ones that
FNAF. I
distort
don't know.
familiar designs,
That works.
like Duck Season and My Friendly Neighborhood. And at the same time, it excludes games like Slender, Granny, Doki Doki Literature Club, and other games that people voted no for on the survey. If it doesn't sound catchy enough, you could instead call it something like Dark Nostalgia, if you excuse it.
Dark Nostalgia?
But yeah, I mean, shit, this might be the best I can come up with. You might be listening to this and thinking to yourself that I'm a dumbass and that we should just stick with mascot horror meaning this. And I'm not going to even pretend that it isn't a pretty perfect word for it, but I still think it makes more sense logically to name it something different. I'm hoping that what I wrote in the crack section got that across for most of you, but ultimately, the internet will probably just continue using mascot horror to mean both definitions, and we'll never really know for sure what each person is referring to until we ask them. And I'll still hate it, but I don't think I'll ever make another video about it. You're welcome.
The end.
Well, that's it. That's the video. I've made long videos before, but not quite 12,000 words long. For those of you who reached the end, well done. And I know that wasn't easy. And if you actually enjoyed this, then let me know. Consider liking the video, but I don't really expect you to subscribe.
It was an interesting video.
Not the kind of content I tend to make. But hey, maybe subscribe to my Buy Me a Coffee server. The amazing people in there were given access to this video early, and they even contributed to some small parts of it. And I guess if you're a fan of Mascot Horror, try following my games, which are literally official but non-canon spin-offs in the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, I don't know. It was an interesting topic to talk about. Like, I didn't think that the term mascot horror was so widely like disagreed upon. Cause like, I don't know, man. It just doesn't that shit just sound like it came like, well, I don't want to sound like an asshole when I say it or like full of myself when I say it, but doesn't like how I define mascot horror just kind of sounds like it came out of a damn textbook? Like, you got the mascot, Freddy Fazbear, the face of the company, and then he watches you through a door that you need to shut because it's designed to scare you, aka horror. So wouldn't that shit be mascot horror? But I guess to some people it wouldn't be, because they A, don't define mascot horror as such, or B, they don't think the game is scary enough for it to be called horror. That must have been so annoying for Kane. Like 1,000 fucking results on a survey for people to be like, this Poppy Playtime is not a mascot horror game. It's a mascot game, but not a horror game because I don't find it scary enough. Like, what the fuck? But yeah, I could sit here and yap for like hours on this. I mean, Kane showed that as an example. No offense to Kane, that was a joke. But yeah, you know, I could sit here and yap about it for hours, but I think I already made my point across. So let me know what you guys think about mascot horror in the comments. What do you consider it as? And I'll see y'all later. Peace out.